The First Tech Challenge is getting a new robot controller and new motor controller and new motors for the 2027-28 season. Let's talk about it.
First is paying attention not just to, hey, let's bring brushless to the First Tech Challenge and make it as powerful as we can.
I'm Coach Pratt, and I've been teaching robotics design for over a decade now, and I've mentored FTC teams to winning national championships. And today I sat down with AJ Foster, a key global tech for the first challenge. We talk all about what the new SystemCore and the new robot controller is going to mean for the First Tech Challenge, what the new MotionCore and motor controller is going to talk about, and what our thoughts are on the new exclusive A301 motor.
My name is AJ Foster. I am a FIRST alumni. At heart, I am a volunteer FIRST technical advisor. At the end of last season, I took on the role of global key volunteer focused on the technology of First Tech Challenge, including a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. And at the beginning of this season, I also became the program delivery partner for First Tech Challenge in Florida. So I get to interact with a lot of people at FIRST talking about technology-related things. I don't make any of the decisions, to be clear, but myself and Frank, the other global key for technology in First Tech Challenge, we get to think a lot about the rules related to technology and inspection. And we do our best to help inform and shape those conversations with folks at FIRST to make sure that it's working well for teams. And as we move into this new control system, we will also be responsible for making a lot of the training resources that volunteers and to a certain extent teams use to help adopt it.
Being one of the key techs and, on the FIRST website, you're in like a supervisory role of the software and the mechanical design, or rather it says, regarded as a supervisor on there. So making all that training software means that AJ and, Frank himself are good guys to listen to and perfect guys to talk to about this new control system update and the SystemCore update, because there's a lot to get our hands on, and there's been a lot of community talk about things going on, some things that may or may not be accurate, some things that may be blown out of proportion, some things that may not be blown out of proportion, maybe some valid concerns. So I thought we'd kind of have this conversation, talk about that, and let's see where it is that we're going. I think one thing that does need to get started from the start is that a lot of this is really only known from what these couple of blog posts that FIRST has put out. And before, myself, AJ, Frank, or teams themselves can make really concrete decisions on whether this is a great decision for FIRST or whether it is completely boneheaded or somewhere in between. I would hope it would be somewhere in between. That teams need to get their hands on these things first, and myself included. I'd love to get my hands on these new parts to be able to actually give a real notion on this. But let's talk about some things that we do know. We do know that in the 2027-2028 season, both FRC and FTC is transitioning over to something that's called the SystemCore. That is this guy right over here. It is a new kind of robot controller. This replaces that control hub. We also know that it is a 5-year transition period where the current systems are going to be legal until at least 2030 or 2031. So it does not mean they're completely defunct when 2027 comes out. Another super cool thing about this is actually powered by Raspberry Pi, so that opens up a lot more abilities for threading and far more than that Cortex ARM5 architecture we're currently running. Because what do you know, AJ? It's like 13 years old at this point, or how old is the control hub Cortex at this point?
The years fly by. I don't actually remember when it rolled out, but I remember when it did. It was equally as exciting, and it felt like we had really matured into the technology that was available at the time, and we're doing that again with the Raspberry Pi CM5. This is what is available to us, and it feels like we're taking full advantage of it.
Yeah, so that's super exciting. The cool thing about this is it's actually recent tech. Like CM5 on Raspberry Pi is actually like a recent processor. I always think of like NASA and the technology that NASA and ESA, the European Space Station, you have to send up. It's always, 5 years out of date because it has to go through all of these space processing points. So it's cool that we actually get like up-to-date stuff. Taking a look at the MotionCore, the interesting thing about this is that there's the SystemCore that FIRST, FRC, and FTC are going to be sharing. But then the MotionCore is something that's specific for FTC. So that SystemCore is sensors, it's control logic, things like that. It's cameras, USB. But then the MotionCore is things like encoders, things like motors, and then what they're also calling a smart sensor. I think that'll be interesting because it's on one of those flip sides of you have more documentation and that FRC and FTC are sharing the same tools, which is awesome. But on the flip side, with removing things like I2C, you run into, there are standard sensors that I'm not sure will be able to have sort of daughter boards that be able to transfer between, where we have things like, my team uses a lot of like Adafruit sensors right now. And if they can't communicate over a CAN bus, I'm not seeing anything that will allow it to communicate with these right now. So perhaps it locks down more of the sensors are coming in, but I'm not sure at the moment because there may be, daughter board devices that allow them to communicate over CAN that exists almost like a level switcher that currently exists right now.
I don't know anything secret, so I'm not alluding to anything, but just to draw an analogy, when we moved from the modern robotics components over to the expansion hub with phone and then later the control hub, there were a lot of teams using modern robotics sensors that worked at 5 volts that needed the level shifter to get it down to 3.3 volts and connect with the new hardware. Obviously, it's not a great analogy between what we're talking about. It's a bit more complicated than that. But just as an example, first took deliberate steps to make sure that there were ways to continue supporting that hardware and make sure that there was a nice, set of resources and set of sensors available for teams to do what they wanted to do. So again, I don't know anything and I'm not making any promises, but that is the type of thing that we pay attention to.
Yeah, I would be really surprised if first kind of threw out all the sensors that currently exist and be like, well, no, there's no way of getting them at all in this new system. That would be really surprising to me because not only then would teams have to buy a new control system and a new, motion system, but also having to get new actuators and new sensors. And all of a sudden it's like, well, veteran teams, no, you don't want to come to this. Like that would be really surprising to me. Right. I think one of the really awesome changes about this MotionCore is that everything is up on these Molex Power Plus pins. And that is huge for so many teams. Like they have a little infographic here where effectively everything gets done on these Molex key connectors. So you don't have your JST PH, you don't have servo cables, you don't have I2C cables, you don't have standard JST XH cables, you don't have encoder cables, you don't have an RS485, and then some teams use servo power hubs because there's 6 volts. So like the amount of times that I've had to show a student how to go from like, oh, you're using a rev motor, you have to use a JST PH to JST PH. Oh, you're using Go Build a motor, you got to use a JST SH to a JST PH. Oh, sorry, those are different things. And then plugging the encoder ports into the wrong port, like that is awesome to be able to plug in, have power and sensors all on the same motor cable. Super cool.
Those Molex MicroFit Plus cables, and specifically that diagram showing the difference in cables, that was one of the moments when I really got it, like what the impact is going to be for this module in particular. Because recently I tried to come up with a little bit of a care package. Like if you have a new first technical advisor volunteer in your area and you want to give them a care package of the common cables that they might be giving away to teams if teams accidentally, chew up one of their cables in some gears or something like that. What do you give them? It was tough, and it was not a small bundle of cables to give away. So this, exactly as you said, this new normal of having the majority of connections be the same type of cable, probably just in different lengths, is going to be pretty powerful, especially on the teaching side, where you don't have to know all of the nitty-gritty details about the names of the connectors and how you crimp them and all that. Just plug it in.
Mm-hmm. The nice thing is it's not a proprietary cable either. Like it's a Molex Mini Power Plus. I mean, some of the students are probably building their own computers. They're probably very familiar with a Molex style connector. It's very similar to the things you're using on power supplies for a computer as well. So a lot of students have done that before, especially in the robotics field. There's been some mixed ideas online about, it's going to remove students from being able to follow through on how these things are plugged in and how you can actually do the wiring. And I think that is a valid consideration. But one thing I will notice, at least from my own robotics curriculum, because I teach robotics to students as my day job, is the amount of time that I have to spend teaching students how to breadboard and how to wire things across on like an Arduino based system or a Feather M Plus system. It takes so much time. And anytime you start adding more than 3 or 4 sensors, it starts to become this massive rat's nest and to be honest, I just ended up filming a video here on teaching students how to turn XT30 connectors into Anderson power pole connectors. And the amount of times that I've had to resolder an XT30 connection this season would blow your mind across all of my teams. I actually don't think it's that bad of a loss to move over to a simpler cable connection, especially because it's non-proprietary.
On the cable front, if you look at the history, we've obviously been through quite a few iterations on how to get what we want out of our hardware when it comes to a control system for First Tech Challenge. So I just have in front of me as an example. If you go back, at some point we were screwing in just bare terminals, and that had obviously came with some problems. Definitely worked with plenty of teams on the field who ended up with motors just pulled out of the cable. You move further into the power pole connections you mentioned, and that was definitely an improvement, but size is a concern here as well. We moved on to the JST VH now we have for motors, and we kept the nice parts about there only being one way to plug it in. Not really an issue with having a good connection. It's just like physically working with that connector can be a pain sometimes. I think we're really honing in on the best here. Definitely the best that I'm aware of in terms of connectors. And I think teams are going to like it too.
Doing wire runs and wire chases is not easy, regardless of how many years in the trenches you've spent it. Like, where's the rainbow? Where's the yellow wire? No, this extra yellow one. No, the other yellow one. Yeah.
Yeah,
and that's actually
a situation where it's actually reasonable for a team to, add a component to the robot and rerun the cables. I think a lot of teams get into the situation where you're making a significant change as you move throughout the season and iterate on your design. And it's just a pain right now to actually do all of the wiring again the way that it, quote, should be done for this new design. And when you have nice bundles like this, you have your power and your communication together, it's reasonable to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Another super cool thing about this is the new battery system. I love that it's moving over to 18-volt power tool batteries. I used to work construction, get an 18-volt DeWalt system in there, lithium ion. That is awesome. And then I don't know if any spent any time watching Project Farm, but I imagine that Project Farm on YouTube has become a lot more popular, testing out what battery from different systems ends up having the highest throughput overall and the highest capacity. Because we're Makita guys over here. No, we're a Ryobi team. And there might be some interesting things in that respect. It's way more accessible. It's got way higher throughput than our current nickel metal hydride batteries do. I'm curious whether First is going to limit it to a 2-amp battery system to allow 4-amp batteries in there. My guess is going to be between 2 and 2.5 amps, maybe even a 3-amp, but I can't imagine them using the big chonkers like a 4-amp battery in that system.
Your guess is as good as mine, because this is definitely the area that we know the least about in all the things that are mentioned in this blog post. But I am also similarly excited about where it could go.
Another cool thing about this is the overall footprint of this. When you look at the control hub of the SystemCore and the MotionCore versus a control hub and expansion hub, you're about 35% smaller overall. I think that's a big win. It's hard for some teams to be fitting some of these control systems in sometimes. To be able to reduce that is pretty cool.
Agreed. I want to give credit where due to the control hub and expansion hub for the sides of the device where cables come out. That was a huge thing in comparison to the modern robotics stuff that came before, is you had wires coming out on multiple sides of every module, and it was really hard to keep all of those sides clear and mount everything correctly. And this is continuing that trend even more, where principally you have a single surface that needs to be available for wiring. And the rest, if you have it encased in something, you're going to be okay.
Now, getting into what I think is probably the more controversial side of the community is talked about with some of the big changes is the first A301. And this is the new standardized motor from 2027, 2028. That means that with the MotionCore, at least at this current point in time, this is the only motor that is allowed for use with the MotionCore. And I've got some thoughts on that. We'll put the thoughts on that in a pin in a moment, but let's talk about what's cool about this motor first, because I think that the motor itself is really cool. I don't think that many people are saying the motor itself is not great. The community backlash seems to be related to the exclusive use of this motor. This is the only motor that you'll be allowed to use with the MotionCore. But we'll talk about that in a moment, because I think there's a lot of really cool things that this motor brings along. Now, the idea is that this replaces all of the servo motors and all of the DC motors in the current system. And, it's made by Rev, but it's distributed by First. That means that GoBuilda, Thrifty, West Coast Products, what other ones are there? Rev, Actobotics, whatever other companies are able to actually sell this out. Plex. So despite, one company making it, others are distributing it, which is cool. It's got CAN-based communication with that micro Molex like we were talking about. It's brushless DC, so the continuous throughput it's going to be able to push through is much higher. It's got an absolute encoder on the output. So all of these will have an encoders from it. It's 24 to 12 volt compliant. Really cool stuff. It's 15 tooth spline, like they've been using FRC for years now. And then at least from what I've been seeing in the power output, it says it's between 2 to 2.5 of the torque output of a core hex. So a core hex will stall at about 125 RPM. At 125 RPM, it'll stall out at 3.2 newton meters. A 117 GoBuilda motor will stall at about 6.7. And at least what this is saying in its power outputs, it'll stall out at about, let's see here, where is it? It'll stall out at 5.27 newton meters at about 100 RPM. So it seems like it's about equivalent to our current 550s that are being used inside of the FTC robots right now for the DC motors. It's got interchangeable gearboxes on it, which is really slick. So teams can be able to swap this in. And I don't know if you know this, AJ. This gearbox here, does it have some sort of smart chip in it so that the program board knows what gear ratio is currently plugged into it?
I believe in another one of the diagrams, or it may even be in the CAD model that you have to go into to find it, there is an electronic component and a way for the system to know what is plugged in for that configuration so that you're using it appropriately if you want to do things analogous to some of the PID functions that we have available today.
Yeah, I think that's awesome to be able to swap in a gearbox and the form factor stays the same, right? Because right now, when you swap through gearboxes, if you're using GoBuilda's system, I don't know if you've ever seen those 30 RPM motors, but those are bad boys at the end compared to the standard Bear motors or, the Ultraplanetary slapping on 3 gearboxes. I mean, you're adding on an extra 30% in real estate. So the fact that you can go from like a similar performance to a Bear motor for like a 6,000 RPM for flywheels to get down to, 30 RPM with the same package is really impressive. And that's really cool.
Yeah.
And then I know
was
some
obviously
teams
a huge thing in all of the planning related to this motor. And we'll talk about that more later, I'm sure. Yeah. But having interchangeable gearboxes that also don't affect the symmetry, that's huge. I think teams are going to like it.
I know that GoBuilda recently put out a blog post here where they're already starting to produce some parts to be able to mesh this thing together with their system. Because that was another thing I've heard online and something that piqued my brain as well. I was like, oh, it's all M3 hardware. I'm going to have to switch over to Rev stuff for a lot of stuff. I'm going to put a bunch of adapter plates. But it seems like, GoBuilda has already sorted some things out. Not surprised. I mean, those guys at that engineering and the girls over there are fantastic. So it's really cool to see them already thinking about that. So yes, to calm some team's fears, M4 hardware will be a thing with these new A301s. I think it's also good to know that, these A301s, we're still a year and a half away before we're even seeing them. And this is a week into us actually knowing these motors exist. So I think we've got a lot of time, as the kids would say, to let first cook in this respect. So I think that's cool.
Let first cook and let all of the manufacturers that support First Tech Challenge do their thing as well. I know this feels like ancient history, but remembering the rollout of the 550 motors that we have now, we weren't in a situation back then where necessarily every manufacturer had their own variant of it like we are today. And, things developed over time. It got really nice. You can mount them inside of the U channel now. So I expect a similar level of development will occur with this pretty quickly, especially given the amount that First is putting out ahead of time. A significant amount of time before these motors will actually be used by teams for competition. We're getting ahead of it.
Yeah, I think that's something that First is getting a lot better at over the seasons too. From what I've heard, inklings, I don't know how much truth there is in this statement, but I've heard that they had let some of the vendors know. Usually they make like a starter kit or a starter robot. And into the deep season, they had let the vendors know what the game was going to be a few weeks before the game was released. So the teams had a few weeks to be able to develop a starter robot. Whereas this season, starter robots really highlighted. As far as I'm aware, they had a few months with the game to be able to actually prepare some starter robots for teams to be able to start building up. And I don't know if you've been seeing this, but the skill floor, the barrier of entry has been raised a lot in that teams have a much easier step to be able to get up. To have low-level competitions is a much higher starting point than it has been in previous seasons. And bringing that to the A301, that seems to be what the purpose of this motor seems to be from First is that, and they said it explicitly that they're trying to level the playing field for teams so that teams can kind of get up and above. Because as much as I love the ability to have different motors and different servos, when you start getting into things like, hobby RC level servos, right? We start talking about things like AGF RC. And I'm sure the team is probably more familiar with, or not teams are probably more familiar with like Axon servos, right? They are phenomenally expensive for what they are. And sometimes I run into some students who I think if they don't have an Axon or they don't have an AGF RC servo on their robot, that they just simply can't compete. And I think, there's some plus sides and downsides to be able to bring this in on a single motor, and that it does make it easier for teams to be able to stay level. Although we'll have to see where things play out when it comes to international shipping with international teams like myself. Trying to get things internationally can be a challenge. And I can think of teams in India, I can think of teams in Romania, I can think of teams in some of the Asian countries that could have a harder time sourcing some of these new parts. But First has been up in their global distribution in the past. So it's hard to tell. And most of that is just huge speculation on whether this is actually going to be a problem, whether it will actually end up working out or not. So that'll be curious. Now,
I hope that teams take the comments that First have made in these blog posts, especially related to the battery system, as evidence that they are paying attention to this issue. The availability of batteries is just one example of things that they're concerned about when it comes to international teams being able to participate at a similar level to domestic teams in terms of what they're able to get their hands on. So I hope that everyone watching will read those words and take it as evidence that people are paying attention and good things will come.
Talking back to like where this motor is going, most of the backlash seems to be coming from the exclusivity of the A301 with MotionCore. What are your thoughts on why you think First might have said this is the only motor that is going to be allowed with MotionCore at this moment? So getting rid of servos and just swapping it all to this MotionCore.
Yeah. So disclaimer, I just have to throw this out there again. I'm not a person making decisions, and I don't know any, secret information that I'm hinting to when I say these things. You mentioned earlier some of the servos where teams feel like if they don't have a particular product, that they feel like they can't compete at the same level. And that's not a great experience. I've definitely felt that before. I was on a first robotics competition team that did not have many resources, and we felt that we would never be able to compete at the same level. Even with a kit of parts that gets shipped to us every year, we felt like we would never be able to match the teams around us just because of the things that we could not buy. And that is, I believe, at the heart of this decision that's been communicated through this blog post about the exclusivity. If we can have a level playing field in terms of the actuators that are available, then that at least provides hopefully a good amount of leveling across the program. Now, you mentioned form factor and missing servos and that sort of thing. I'm sure folks are listening to that. But also, we should be careful to note that the form factor of this A301 is really good. Size comparisons were thrown out at some of these diagrams. I'm really impressed with the engineering effort that has gone in to make this something that is reasonable, not just to have mounted in a U channel for your drivetrain, not just, used for a shooter for artifacts for this year's game, if First decides to design something like that in the future, but also could be mounted at a distance, on an arm, that sort of thing. Maybe it's not as great as the smallest servo that you can buy and use in First Tech Challenge today, but it is pretty good, and I think teams will be impressed with how versatile it is when they get their hands on it.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it compared to DC motors, it's a half to maybe a third of the size of some of these DC motors. I mean, comparing it to an ultraplanetary, it's like maybe a third of that with a full gearbox on. But on the flip side, comparing it's about twice the size of two standard servos stacked up together. So as far as a replacement for a DC motor on a drivetrain, that's going to be wicked. Absolutely wicked. Having a brushless motor for a drivetrain and something this small, this package, and a right angle gear as well, really cool. That's really slick. I would be curious, and I'd love to get my hands on this just to see how well that spline is able to take some impacts to be able to do a direct drive system off of this. Because that's one of the things we've seen with doing a planetary and move away from spur gears into this is now we've got a spur gearbox moving into this again. So I'm curious to see how well this is able to take impacts and if it's going to need some sort of intermediary system in between. Again, won't really know until we actually take this thing to a hammer while it's running and see what happens there. Very scientific tests. Yeah. One thing I do see that has been a backlash on that servo point is the sizing of the servo. Now, one thing that a lot of people have mentioned that makes FTC, and it's actually part of the reason I really like FTC as a challenge, is that the robots are a lot smaller. The engineering that goes into it is significantly more compact. Sizing constraints are far less of a deal or far more of a deal in FTC than they are in FRC in that respect. And at least in previous games, it's been highlighted by smaller, compact systems. And using things like standardized, mini servos, standard size servos, micro size servos. It'll be interesting to see at this current point how teams adapt. I hope I'm hanging my hat on. I hope we get a smaller potential actuator in here so we could open up some of these. If that doesn't happen, it'll be really interesting. And I'm very curious to see how the game design committee moves into that 2027, 2028 season to design a game that is beneficial for both subsystem types.
I don't know anything about game design, so again, not hinting at anything in any of this, but I think with some of the statements you see written down related to how the motor is powered and what its capabilities are, I hope that teams take away from that First is paying attention not just to, let's bring brushless to the First Tech Challenge and make it as powerful as we can. There's also very careful attention being paid to making sure that the teams that are able to transition to this new system quickly versus the teams that require a few more years to transition, it's not going to be a huge power imbalance between them in terms of just like the raw power of the motors that you have access to. So if you can extrapolate from that a bit, first is also going to pay attention to the difference in the game tasks as they're applied to the new systems. And again, I don't know anything, but hopefully you take away from that it's not you won't hopefully see game tasks that are wildly more fitted to the new system or the old system than the other.
And I think it'd be really interesting in that transition phase, because they do mention here that there will be teams that are allowed to use the SystemCore and an expansion hub as a way of being able to put through. And I'm curious if it is a SystemCore, a MotionCore, and an expansion hub, or if it's a SystemCore and an expansion hub, or if it's somewhere around in between so that you can use the A301s and some of the old motors. Because that would be really interesting. And I think teams would be pretty happy about being the best of both worlds there. And you can still use, I think that's one of the things, you can still use standard servos. They've been pretty clear in their writing here that you're still going to be able to use the motors that you currently are for at least the next 6 years, which is pretty wild and also pretty cool. That would be really interesting to see where FIRST decides to take that expansion hub. And we know nothing about the idea other than the fact that like it's going to be a thing. What it looks like, I don't know. Right? But you're going to be able to use them at least until, 2031. So that'll be interesting to see. I think one of the big things that's getting teams antsy is price. What is the cost of this system going to be? And I don't think there's been zero notion whatsoever about what cost is.
Have nothing to share there.
Yeah.
Other than to say that as you've seen with the rollout plan, the number of years involved in having both models available, and the explicit statement that FIRST made in the section about motor and servo legality, like they are trying to reduce in total the financial impact and diffuse that impact over the years. They hear this.
Yeah. I think one thing that I could see a lot of teams wanting to see is like a starter pack for teams that already have build kits, right? Like I've also seen some concerns that, you have to buy another starter kit. It's like, oh, great. Now I have, another 4 traction wheels that I don't need and a whole bunch of extra, aluminum extrusion. Cool. Don't need this right now. All I need is the system, MotionCore, and some motors. So I really hope they put out like I don't know if they would do like a discounter thing or like, hey, you can buy the SystemCore, the MotionCore, and 4 motors. You could buy the SystemCore, the MotionCore, and 8 motors. And you can buy it as a bundle. And like, that's all you get. That's all that you need. And then you can move on from there without trying to also bundle in additional value points, especially for teams that want to upgrade to the new system. Because I think that SystemCore looks awesome. Like there are just so many great things about this new SystemCore and this new MotionCore as well that teams are going to want to jump over. That having an upgrade platform that doesn't require additional fees for teams is going to be pretty critical.
There are 2 aspects of that to address. First is what's available through the FIRST storefront that teams can purchase with, for example, grants that they get through FIRST versus what's available from the individual resellers. So just a reminder, especially on the A301 actuator, that this will be broadly available. And if individual companies want to repackage it as part of a kit, I don't know that they will do that or that they will even want to do that. But they can make informed decisions about that. Maybe, and this is just completely hypothetical, maybe we'll see kits that you can buy the actuators and the plates that you need to use them with your existing hardware, but none of the additional hardware that you probably already have. I think that would be a cool experience for teams. I'd be excited to see that. But the A301 will also be available through the FIRST storefront. At least that's what I remember reading in this blog post. So just as you have the driver kit and the command and control bundle today in the first storefront. You'll also be able to buy these motors. There has been nothing said about what they will be packaged with. So I'm sure if you are a team that has strong feedback about that, you should speak up and first we'll take note of it. But it is at least very cool that there is some effort to expand what is available through that storefront and what's available through grant funds in the future.
Yeah, I think that's great for US teams to be able to get into that. I think that would be a big thing. One of the things that I'm thinking about and seeing more chatter online is the international team. So the first storefront, I mean, to be court, is not very useful over here in the Netherlands because I have to pay 21% VAT and shipping on top of that. That it doesn't help. So I do wonder, and I hope that they're thinking about how international teams that are joining in, because there's been a lot more international presence coming into first, which is fantastic. I absolutely love it. I'm seeing more regions pop up every season and more teams joining in every season as well. Some of our good friends that used to compete in our region now have their own region inside of Europe, which is cool. So I think that's going to be a big thing for them to be moving forward into the future.
As a program delivery partner, I think about growth of the program in my region, which is Florida in the United States. And we've had a lot of growth this season for us, and it's been really great to see. But, in comparison, the amount of growth that we've seen internationally is incredible. And I love to see it, and First loves to see it, and they love to support it as well. So no promises on anything, but the international growth that we've seen in recent years has definitely turned some heads. And hopefully we'll see some good things to support it.
Last thing I want to talk about is I want to hear your thoughts on First. Some people are saying First is going back to its roots in that it split off from VEX a while ago. And VEX is, of course, a very closed off system. You have to buy VEX parts. You have to buy VEX motors. Everything that is used on a VEX robot, to the best of my knowledge, outside of a few sheets of polycarbonate and a few custom parts, is a VEX point. What are your thoughts on moving to a single actuator, and whether you think that will encourage this copycat behavior that happens quite a bit in VEX? Because that's one of the things I love about First is that you do get to bring in a lot of your own 3D printed parts, your own design parts, your own sheet metal bent parts and things like that, laser cut, plywood, and multiplex, depending on where you are.
I understand where folks are coming from, and I understand the narrative that might be building in some folks' mind when you look at the emphasis on the starter bots this year and how developed they were before kickoff. And this announcement about the A301 and the single actuator. I get it, but I just want to point out that even with the renewed focus on starter bots, that did not come with a significant reduction in the materials that are available. Even with the announcement of this A301, there was no mention of a reduction in the other build materials that you might be able to use with them. I hope that First has made clear to most folks that the reasons for the exclusivity on the A301 are very narrow in scope. And it's not necessarily a hint at those broader changes you suggested.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. There's a lot of positivity that can come out of this, I think. And there's a lot of really cool changes and things that can really advance the program for teams. Moving to this new system core, moving to this new MotionCore, moving to this new motor. And I think there's a lot of concerns around it. And I think a lot of folks are concerned about change. And until we can see these things in our hands and play with them and test with them and work them out, and we're still a few seasons away from it even being introduced as a point, I think it would be a good idea on First's end to share out sooner rather than later, if they have this docs, what does it look like? How could teams use the A301s and their current DC motors and servos in a robot if they know what that is going to look like at this point in time, because I think that would really help qualm a lot of the community's thoughts on where this new transition system is going. Now that being said, I'm a huge fan of leveling out the playing field to make it a little simpler for some other teams to be able to come in and join out with that, because especially in the world of hobby RC motors, you can get a little crazy with servo motors and where that goes. I've seen some micro servos that upwards of €400 a piece for a single micro servo, just banana stuff. I'm like, well, that's half of most robot funds to be able to build these things up and running. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, and understand the difficulty of writing blog posts like this. We're still in early days for the MotionCore, especially. And one of the things they call out is that SystemCore has undergone some iterations based on the alpha test feedback. Teams don't have MotionCore in hand. They haven't had a chance to discover what might need to change with it before it gets rolled out to the broader population of teams. So if First is not saying something about exactly what the rules are going to be for a hybrid system or things like that, to a certain extent, it may be because we just don't know yet. We don't know what might change between now and then. And there's a line that you have to walk between transparency and locking yourself into what might not be the best way to go. So imagine a situation where First had come out in these blog posts and given the answers to all the questions that folks have had. And then they were kind of locked into those answers to a certain extent. That might not have been a good situation. Or the situation where First didn't publish these blog posts and waited until they had all the answers and all the uncertainty that would come out through the alpha testing process with MotionCore. That would also not be a good situation. So that's such a hard line to walk. I hope teams appreciate that, because this is a lot of transparency to come from First. And especially in a situation where a lot is still unknown. But we do have to just kind of wait and see on a lot of things, how they're going to play out.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see where this ends up going. I mean, like I said at the start of this chat, making concrete decisions is really hard to judge right now. And teams really need to get their hands on these things before some concrete decisions are being made. Myself included. I'd personally love, if First is watching, I would love to get some hands on this to be able to test it around and do some monkeying around with it. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes. Any other thoughts or things you want to share about the transition to the MotionCore and the SystemCore and A301?
I'm excited to see it play out. I'm excited for teams in the alpha testing to get their hands on it and get a chance to really try it. Some things will not be the way that they will be in the end. The driver station side of things, for example, teams will be working on a desktop computer instead of a driver hub while they're testing these things. So we won't get the full picture, but we will start to get the gist of how this is going to play out. Just a reminder, we talk about the seasons, and I just want to remind everyone that it's January of 2027 for SystemCore in First Robotics Competition. It's September of 2027 for First Tech Challenge. So those aren't aligned. Those aren't the overlapping seasons. So we have a lot of time between now and then to figure out those details and just keep an eye out for updates, because as teams get their hands on things, as we figure out more about where this is going to end up, there will be a lot more information shared, and hopefully you'll see some of your feedback reflected in those discussions.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your perspective tonight, AJ, and sharing your thoughts on the new MotionCore A301. I'm curious what the rest of you guys think about this transition. What are your thoughts on it? Let us know in the comments down below. And as always, best of luck out there this FTC season.